Before I tell you how my parents found out, they skipped their daughter's wedding to a billionaire. And yes, they found out on national television. And yes, it was exactly as satisfying as it sounds. I need you to understand something. I didn't marry Ethan because he was rich. I didn't even know he was rich until long after I'd already fallen for the man who showed up to a biotech conference in a flannel shirt and asked me a question about protein folding that made me forget there were other people in the room. I married him because he was the first person in my life who saw me standing in a room and didn't look past me to find someone more interesting. My whole life, I was the wrong daughter. Not the pretty one, not the fun one, not the one my mother introduced first at church or brought up at dinner parties or posted about on Facebook. That was Ashley. 3 years older, blonde, cheerleading captain, homecoming court 2 years running. Ashley could walk into a room, and the room would rearrange itself around her, like furniture sliding into place. I'd walk into the same room, and people would ask me to grab them a drink. We grew up in Edina, Minnesota, which, if you don't know Edina, is the kind of suburb where the lawns are immaculate and the smiles are mandatory, and everybody drives something German. My mother, Linda, kept the house like she was expecting a magazine crew at all times. Fresh flowers on the entry table every Monday, coasters that matched the season. She had a way of making everything look perfect from the outside, which was her greatest skill and, I would later realize, her only one. My dad, Richard, was the kind of father who said your mother means well the way other people say it is what it is. A verbal shrug. He worked in insurance, came home at 6, read the paper, and agreed with whatever Linda had already decided. I don't think he was cruel. I think he was just tired. Tired in a way that made him choose silence every single time. And silence, when your kid needs you to speak up, is its own kind of cruelty. Ashley was the experiment that confirmed their hypothesis, that they were good parents, that their family was admirable, that the Aldridge name meant something in Edina. I was the data point they couldn't explain, so they just didn't include me in the results. I got straight A's. Nobody mentioned it. I placed first in the regional science fair sophomore year. Mom said, "That's nice, honey," the same way she'd say it if I told her I found a quarter in the couch. I won a full scholarship to the University of Minnesota. Dad said, "Well, that saves us some money." Ashley got a C+ in sociology that same semester, and Mom threw her a spa day because she'd been working so hard. But the moment the one I carry around, like a stone in my coat pocket, the one I can't seem to put down, no matter how far I walk, happened when I was 16. State Science Fair, Minneapolis Convention Center. I'd spent 4 months on a research project about biofilm-resistant coatings for medical implants, 4 months of weekends in the school lab, 4 months of my biology teacher, Mr. Prosters, Kessler, staying late to help me calibrate instruments. I made the finals. Then I won. They called my name, and I walked up to that stage in a gymnasium full of strangers. The applause was polite and generic. I held the trophy, cheap gold plastic, heavier than it looked, and I smiled, and a photographer from the Star Tribune snapped a picture and asked, "Where's your family?" I said, "They're busy." They were at Ashley's cheerleading banquet. I found out later because Mom posted 7 photos of it on Facebook. Ashley in her uniform. Ashley with her squad. Ashley holding a bouquet someone gave her for being most spirited. 7 photos. 0 mentions of a state science fair. 0 mentions of me. Grandma June came. She drove 45 minutes from St. Paul in her old Buick, arrived late, and sat in the back row with her coat still on. She was the only person in that auditorium who belonged to me. After the ceremony, she took me to a diner and ordered us both pancakes at 4 in the afternoon and said, "Vanessa, I want you to listen to me. The people who show up when you have nothing are the only ones who matter." I thought she was being sentimental. She was being precise. Grandma June died 3 years ago. Quietly, in her sleep, the way she did everything without making anyone else uncomfortable. She left Ashley her pearl earrings. She left me her recipe book, a fat, stained, falling apart binder full of handwritten recipes with notes in the margins like "add more butter," "Richard is wrong," and this one is for Vanessa's graduation, whenever that is. I brought that recipe book with me when I moved to Minneapolis 2 years ago. It sits on my kitchen counter, between the coffee maker and a stack of mail I keep meaning to sort. I haven't cooked from it yet. I tell myself I'm too busy. The truth is, I'm afraid that if I open it, I'll find something in there that makes me cry, and I've built a life specifically designed to avoid crying about the Aldridge family. The trophy, by the way, I kept it, but I never put it on a shelf. It's in a box in my closet underneath a winter coat I don't wear anymore. Not hidden exactly, just not displayed. Because displaying it would mean it mattered. And admitting it mattered would mean admitting they should have been there. And admitting they should have been there would mean admitting that they chose not to be. And I wasn't ready to do the math on that. Not yet. I moved to Minneapolis 2 years ago. I told myself it was for the job biomedical engineer at a med tech startup. Good salary, interesting work. The kind of role where people actually read your reports and responded to your emails, which felt like a miracle after 26 years of being the family footnote. But it was also the first time I lived somewhere my mother hadn't decorated. And the silence in that apartment wasn't the silence of being ignored. It was just silence. Mine. Clean and empty and mine. That's where I was quiet, employed, alone in a way that felt more like breathing room than loneliness, when I met a man in a flannel shirt who changed everything. I met Ethan Cross on a Thursday in February at a biotech conference in downtown Minneapolis. The kind of conference where everyone wears lanyards and says synergy without irony, and the coffee tastes like it was brewed in 2019 and never updated. I was presenting a poster on antimicrobial surface coatings. Not a keynote, not a spotlight panel, just a poster in a hallway between the bathrooms and the snack table. The kind of placement that tells you exactly where you rank. I'd spent 3 weeks on it. My boss said, "Good stuff, Vanessa," and walked away to network with someone from Boston. I was standing next to my poster, explaining biofilm adhesion rates to a man who was clearly just waiting for the bathroom, when someone behind me said, "What's your inhibition threshold on the gram-negative strains?" I turned around. Flannel shirt. Jeans that had actually been worn. Not purchased to look worn. Name tag that said Ethan in Sharpie on a blank sticker. No company, no title, just the name, like he'd filled it out himself at the registration table and hadn't bothered with the rest. He was maybe 32, 33. Brown hair that needed a cut. A watch on his left wrist that looked like it came from a gas station display case. And eyes that were doing something I wasn't used to looking directly at me. Not at the poster behind me. Not scanning the room over my shoulder. At me. I answered his question. He asked another one. A better one. Then a third one that made me pull out my laptop and show him raw data I hadn't included in the poster because I thought nobody would care. We talked for 2 hours. We missed the keynote. We missed the networking lunch. At some point, someone set a tray of stale sandwiches on a table near us, and we ate them without stopping the conversation, standing up, crumbs on the carpet, and I remember thinking, this is the first time in my professional life that someone has been more interested in my work than in finding out who I know. He walked me to the parking ramp afterward. His car was a Subaru Outback dark green, at least 8 years old, with a dent in the rear bumper and golden retriever hair embedded so deeply in the back seat, it was essentially upholstery. There was a travel mug in the cup holder with a faded university logo I couldn't quite read, and a stack of papers on the passenger seat held together with a binder clip. "Sorry about the car," he said. "I drive a 2017 Civic. With a check engine light I've been ignoring for 5 months," I said. "Your car has a dog. You win." He laughed. It was a good laugh, the kind that starts in the chest, not the throat. He gave me his number. I called him 2 days later, which was 46 hours longer than I wanted to wait. Our first date was ramen at a place on Nicollet Avenue where the tables wobbled and the broth was transcendent. He ordered extra nori. He asked about my grandmother. He remembered every detail I'd mentioned at the conference, the biofilm research, the startup, the fact that I'd said I moved to Minneapolis for a fresh start without explaining what I was starting fresh from. He didn't push. He just left space. And I walked into that space like someone finding a room with a door that was already open. My best friend Claire, who sat 12 feet from me at work and had the emotional radar of a submarine sonar system, noticed the change within a week. "You're humming," she said, dropping into the chair across from my desk. "You don't hum. You're a person who sighs aggressively and mutters about calibration errors. What happened?" "I met someone." "Name?" "Ethan." "Last name?" "Cross." "Occupation?" "Biotech. Something with diagnostics. I think he runs a small company." Claire narrowed her eyes. "You think. You've been on 3 dates, and you think. We talk about other things." "Vanessa, what does he drive?" "A Subaru with a dog in it." "What does he wear?" "Flannel. Sometimes a quarter zip." Claire leaned back and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Then she looked at me and said, "So he's hot and he drives a car that looks like it survived a camping trip? Vanessa, I will fight you for this man. I will fight you in this office. Human resources will have to get involved." That was Claire. She said out loud the things I was only beginning to let myself think quietly. 3 months in, Ethan took me to his house for the first time. It was a 3-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood in St. Louis Park. Not fancy, not run down, just comfortable. A porch with 2 chairs, a kitchen that smelled like coffee and rosemary, bookshelves in the living room, crammed with biology texts and paperback novels, and a framed photo of an older man in a high school hallway, holding a model of a DNA helix and smiling like he'd just told a joke nobody else would get. "That's my dad," Ethan said. "Henry. He taught biology at Cedar Falls High for 31 years. He looks like he loved it. More than anything, Ethan touched the watch on his wrist, that cheap-looking, scuffed-up thing he never took off. He died when I was 24. Left me this watch and a belief that the work matters more than the title on the door. I didn't ask more. Not that night. The way he touched that watch told me everything I needed to know for now that the man standing in front of me in a house that smelled like rosemary was someone who measured wealth in things that couldn't be deposited. And somewhere in the back of my brain, in the part that still ran on my mother's operating system, a small calculation was already beginning. How do I explain him to my parents? How do I make him sound impressive enough? What words do I use? So Mom doesn't do that silence, that 3-second pause that means I'm disappointed, but I'll say it's fine. I hated that the calculation existed. I hated that even here, in the best thing that had ever happened to me, my first instinct was to translate it into a language my mother would accept. Have you ever introduced someone you love to your family and watched them measure that person like a piece of furniture, checking if they match the room? That's what I was already dreading. And I hadn't even told them yet. 6 months after the ramen place on Nicolette, Ethan proposed. We were in his kitchen. He'd made pasta badly, because Ethan could build a billion-dollar company, but could not cook penne without turning it to cement, and he pulled the ring out of his pocket like he was handing me a pen. No knee, no speech. Just, "I want to be married to you. I don't care about the details. I just want to be on the official record as the guy who gets to sit across from you at dinner for the rest of his life." The ring was simple, a thin gold band with a small stone that caught the overhead light in his kitchen. Not a diamond the size of a guilt trip, which is what Derek had given Ashley, presented on a rooftop in Cabo, photographed from 11 angles for Instagram. Ethan's ring looked like it had been chosen by someone who paid attention to what I actually wore, which was almost nothing on my hands, ever, because I spent my days in a lab where jewelry was a contamination risk. I said yes before he finished the sentence. Then I ate the terrible pasta because he'd made it for me, and that mattered more than texture. Then I had to call my mother. I sat in Ethan's driveway for 12 minutes before dialing. I know it was 12 minutes because I watched the clock on the dashboard like a scientist monitoring a reaction waiting for the right moment, as if there were a right moment to tell Linda Aldridge something she hadn't pre-approved. She picked up on the second ring. "Vanessa, I was just telling your father about Ashley's trip to Sedona. She sent the most gorgeous photos. Have you seen her stories?" "I haven't, Mom." "Listen, I have some news." "Oh?" Ethan proposed. "We're getting married." 3 seconds of silence. I counted. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. That silence was the most honest thing my mother had said to me in years. Then, well, that's nice. Nice. The word she used for my science fair. The word she used for my scholarship. The word she used for every single thing I'd ever done that she couldn't post about. Nice delivered with the warmth of a medical bill. When were you thinking? Ashley's been talking about doing a vow renewal for her 5th anniversary, so you'll want to make sure the dates don't. We're thinking April. The 19th. April. Another silence. And the venue? A restored barn outside Stillwater. A friend of Ethan's owns the property. It's beautiful, Mom. Wildflowers, string lights, a barn. Not a question. A verdict. I kept going anyway. The way I'd always kept going, adding evidence to a case no jury would ever deliberate. It seats about 70. We're keeping it small. Close friends. Some people from work. Ethan's Wayne Zizi. Vanessa, I think we should talk about this in person. Why don't you and Ethan come for dinner? I should have heard the trap. I didn't. I heard my mother inviting me to dinner, and the 16-year-old inside me who stood alone on a stage in Minneapolis thought, maybe this time. 2 weeks later, Ethan and I drove to Adina. He wore khakis and a blue button-down and his father's watch. He'd gotten a haircut. He brought wine, a good bottle, not flashy, something a biology teacher's son would know to pick. I was so nervous my hands were doing the thing they do when I can't control the variables. Opening and closing, like my fingers were trying to grab something that wasn't there. We pulled into the driveway, Ethan in his Subaru, between Dad's Lexus and Derek's BMW. The Subaru looked like a punchline between 2 setup lines. Linda opened the door in a cashmere sweater and full makeup at 6:30 on a Tuesday. She hugged Ethan. The way you hug someone at a funeral you didn't want to attend, arms touching, body pulled back, 3 seconds maximum. So nice to finally meet you. Vanessa talks about you often. Not all the time, or nonstop, or she can't stop. Often, measured, rationed. Dinner was roast chicken and conversation about Ashley, Derek's new commercial real estate deal, Ashley's interior designer, Ashley and Derek's trip to Cabo, which had apparently generated enough content to power a small media company. Every time Ethan asked my mother a question about her garden, about the house, about Adina, she answered in the fewest words structurally possible. Yes, no, it's fine, we like it. My father said, "Good grip," when he shook Ethan's hand. Then he retreated into his roast chicken like a man entering witness protection. At one point, Linda turned to Ethan and said, "And what do you do exactly?" Vanessa said biotech. "But that's so broad." Ethan said, "I run a small company. Diagnostics mostly. We're trying to make screening tools more accessible for rural hospitals." Ah. Linda nodded the way she nodded at school plays present, polite, already thinking about the drive home. That sounds very worthwhile. Worthwhile. The cousin of nice. The whole family of words that meant not enough. On the drive home, Ethan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your mom has a beautiful garden. She just doesn't know how to let anyone else enjoy it." I almost told him everything right then, the science fair, the scholarship, the years of being the Aldridge footnote. But I didn't, because explaining it would mean it was real, and I was still running the experiment where maybe the results would change if I just adjusted one more variable. 3 weeks before the wedding, my mother called. "Vanessa, your father and I have been talking." Her church voice, the one she used for delivering verdicts disguised as concern. "We just don't think we can support this. A barn? With no proper reception? No planner? Sweetheart, this is, I'm sorry, but it's a disgrace. To you, to the family name, to everything we raised you to. Mom. And frankly, it's Ashley's birthday weekend. We already booked the yacht. She needs this, Vanessa. She's been under so much stress with the renovation. And your sister needs the shrimp tower. It's her birthday." The shrimp tower. My mother chose a shrimp tower on a rented yacht over her own daughter's wedding. delivered with the conviction of a woman who genuinely believed she was being reasonable. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I said, "Okay, Mom," and I hung up. I sat in my car in the parking lot of my office for a long time. The engine was off. The windows were up. The world outside was doing that Minnesota spring thing where the light is bright but the air is still cold, and everything looks crisp and clean and completely indifferent to what's happening inside your chest. The tears didn't come for 40 minutes. They waited until I was in the bathroom, on the 3rd floor of the lab building, the one nobody uses, because the hand dryer sounds like a jet engine. I locked the stall door and pressed my forehead against the cool metal partition and cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was 16 years old, standing alone on a stage, holding a trophy nobody came to see. 3 deep breaths. 2 fists unclenched. One decision I wasn't ready to make yet. The week after my mother called my wedding a disgrace, I made my first error at work. It was a decimal point. 1 decimal point in a dataset of 4,000 entries, the kind of mistake a first-year intern catches in review. Except nobody caught it because nobody checks my work, they trust me. I'm the person who doesn't make mistakes. I'm the person who triple-checks the triple-check. That's not a personality trait. That's a survival strategy I learned at the Aldridge dinner table. If you're perfect, maybe they'll notice. If you're flawless, maybe they'll turn their heads. I caught the error myself at 11 p.m., sitting at my desk long after everyone else had gone home. I stared at the screen for a while. The cursor blinked. The office hummed that low, empty sound buildings make when they're pretending to be asleep. I corrected the decimal point, saved the file, and drove home in a silence that had nothing clean about it. Claire noticed the next morning. She brought me coffee, the good kind, from the place 2 blocks over, not the office machine that dispensed liquid regret, and set it on my desk without saying anything. She looked at me the way you look at a bridge you're not sure can hold weight anymore. "I'm fine," I said. "You're wearing yesterday's shirt," she said. I looked down. She was right. I hadn't gone home to change. I'd slept in the parking ramp for 3 hours in the back seat of my Civic, which was not a decision I remembered making, which scared me more than the sleeping itself. The next few days moved the way water moves under ice, slow, heavy, going somewhere you can't see. I went to work. I came home. I ate what was available, which was mostly cereal, and the last of a bag of pretzels that had gone soft. The apartment got quieter. Not because anything changed about it, the same walls, the same furniture, the same coffee maker next to Grandma June's recipe book, but because I was quieter inside it. Like I was shrinking, occupying less space. Ethan called every night. I answered because not answering would generate questions, and questions required energy I was routing elsewhere into standing upright, into brushing my teeth, into the mechanical process of being a person who functions. "How are you?" "Good. Busy. Work stuff. You want me to come over?" "No, I'm fine. Really. Just tired." I wasn't fine. I was doing the thing I'd done my whole life, collecting data points that proved I didn't matter, and refusing to accept the conclusion. My mother chose a yacht. My father said nothing. My sister didn't call. The experiment was over. The results were in, and I was still standing at the bench, adjusting variables, checking for contamination, recalibrating instruments, because if I stopped running the experiment, I'd have to read the results, and the results said, "You were never enough for them, and you were never going to be." On a Thursday night, 8 days after the phone call, I started unpacking a box I'd never fully unpacked since moving to Minneapolis. It sat in the hall closet behind the vacuum. I don't know why I opened it that night. Maybe because I'd run out of ways to avoid it. Maybe because the apartment was so quiet that doing nothing felt louder than doing something. Inside, old textbooks, a pair of shoes I didn't remember owning, a folder of college transcripts, and at the bottom, underneath a winter coat I hadn't worn in 3 years, the trophy. Cheap gold plastic, heavier than it looked. The engraving slightly off-center. First place Minnesota State, Science Fair, 2014. I held it with both hands. The way you hold something fragile even though it isn't, Because the thing itself isn't fragile, what it represents is. I sat on the floor. Not a decision. My legs just stopped working, and the floor was there. The apartment was dark, except for the kitchen light, which threw a long yellow stripe across the hallway floor and stopped just short of where I was sitting, like even the light didn't quite reach me. And that's when it happened. Not a revelation, not a lightning bolt, just a slow, terrible clarity, like a lens coming into focus on something you've been squinting at for 28 years. I had been performing for an empty auditorium my entire life. Every degree, every late night in the lab, every perfect data set, every flawless report, every carefully worded email to my mother, using vocabulary I'd calculated to impress, all of it was evidence in a trial I'd been building since I was 16 years old. Evidence that I was worth seeing, evidence that I mattered, a closing argument delivered to a jury that had left the courtroom before I ever walked in. My mother didn't skip my wedding because it was in a barn. She skipped it because skipping it was easy. Because I had spent my whole life making it easy to overlook me by never demanding to be seen. I was always fine, always capable, always the one who didn't need anything, and so they gave me nothing and called it fair. The trophy sat in my lap like a question I didn't know how to answer. Grandma June's recipe book was on the coffee table. I'd carried it in there at some point. I don't remember when. I didn't open it. I just looked at it from the floor. This battered binder full of recipes from a woman who drove 45 minutes in a Buick to watch me win something, who ordered pancakes at 4 p.m. and called it a celebration. The people who show up when you have nothing are the only ones who matter. I didn't get up that night. I sat on the floor until my back ached, and the kitchen light made my eyes burn, and the trophy left a red impression on my palms where I'd been gripping it without realizing. Then Ethan was there. I hadn't answered his calls in 2 days. He didn't ask permission to come. He used the spare key I'd given him months ago and didn't announce himself. He just appeared in the hallway in a t-shirt and jeans and his father's watch, and he saw me on the floor in the dark holding a plastic trophy, and he didn't say a word. He sat down next to me, close enough that our shoulders touched. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't offer solutions. He didn't say it's going to be okay, or they don't deserve you, or any of the things people say when they want to help but don't know how. He just sat there, in the dark, on the floor, with me. After a long time, I don't know how long, because time stops working properly when you're that far down, he said, quietly. My dad used to say something. He'd say, "You don't owe anyone a version of yourself that makes them comfortable." I didn't respond. But something shifted. Not a fix. Not even close to a fix. Just a hairline crack in something that had been sealed shut for a very long time. And through that crack, the thinnest line of light. If you were sitting on that floor, holding a trophy from a life nobody clapped for, would you still go through with the wedding? Or would you call it off just to stop hurting? I didn't get up that night. But the next morning, I opened the recipe book. The recipe book opened with a crack, the way old binders do when the plastic has gone stiff and the pages have settled into each other like sleeping passengers on a long flight. I sat at the kitchen table with coffee I'd actually brewed, not reheated, not skipped, and turned to the first page. Grandma June's handwriting was small and slanted and completely certain of itself. The first recipe was for buttermilk biscuits. In the margin, she'd written, "Too much flour and they're bricks. Not enough and they're sad." Life works the same way. Under that, in different ink, added years later, "Richard disagrees. Richard is wrong." I almost smiled. Almost. I turned pages slowly. Pot roast with notes about which butcher to trust. A lemon cake marked for Easter, unless nobody deserves it that year. Green bean casserole with the word N-O written in red pen and circled 3 times, which I assumed was her verdict on the dish itself. Every recipe had notes, not just cooking notes, life notes, observations, opinion. The entire binder was less a cookbook and more a woman's running commentary on 60 years of feeding people who sometimes deserved it and sometimes didn't. I reached the inside of the back cover and stopped. There, in blue ink, in handwriting steadier than the rest, like she'd taken her time, like she knew this one mattered, was an inscription. For Vanessa, who never needed anyone's permission to be extraordinary, cook something wonderful. Then eat it yourself. June. I read it 3 times. The first time, the words just sat there, flat on the page. The second time, they started to rearrange something in my chest, the way tectonic plates shift slow, deep, not visible from the surface, but changing the entire geography underneath. The third time, I closed the binder and pressed both palms flat on the cover and held them there like I was keeping something from escaping, or maybe letting something in, who never needed anyone's permission to be extraordinary. My whole life, I had been asking for permission. Not out loud, I was too proud for that, too Aldridge for that. But every report I perfected, every degree I earned, every time I made myself smaller at the dinner table so Ashley could be bigger, that was a permission slip. Stamped and submitted to a woman who never even opened the envelope. Grandma June hadn't waited for me to be extraordinary. She drove 45 minutes in a Buick. She ordered pancakes at 4 p.m. She wrote an inscription in the back of a recipe book and trusted me to find it when I was ready. I showered. I put on clean clothes. I drove to work. Claire was at her desk, pretending not to watch me walk in. She had the subtlety of a car alarm. The effort was there, but the execution gave everything away. I set my bag down, pulled up my chair, and said, "I'm getting married in a barn, without my parents, and I'm going to stop pretending that's not enough." Claire didn't blink. She didn't cheer. She didn't say "finally," or "I told you so," or anything performative. She just nodded once, slowly, the way you nod when someone says something you've been waiting to hear for a long time. Then she said, "Good. I already bought a dress. It has pockets." Pockets? Deep ones. For tissues. Because I'm going to cry, Vanessa. I'm going to cry so hard they'll hear me in Wisconsin. But I'll have pockets, so it'll be dignified. For the first time in 2 weeks, I laughed. Not a big laugh, the kind that sneaks out before you can catch it, like a bird escaping through a window you forgot was open. But it was real. And real was enough. That evening, I drove to Ethan's house. He was in the kitchen, not cooking, just standing there with a mug of tea, looking out the window at his backyard where the snow was finally melting into patches of mud and the first pale green of something trying to grow. He turned when he heard me come in, and his face did the thing it always did when he saw me, a small rearrangement, like everything settled into the right place. "Hey," he said. "Hey." I put my keys on the counter. "Let's do this. All of it. The barn, the 63 people, the wildflowers, your friend's property. I want the string lights and the mismatched chairs and the playlist we made on that road trip to Duluth." "Yeah?" "Yeah. I'm done waiting for an audience that's not coming." He set down his tea and crossed the kitchen and put his arms around me. And I stood there for a while with my face against his flannel shirt because, of course, it was flannel. It was always flannel. And I let myself be held by someone who had never once asked me to be anything other than the person standing in his kitchen on a Tuesday. Later, on the couch, with takeout from the Thai place that always gave us extra spring rolls, because Ethan once helped the owner's daughter with her college biology homework, I asked him about the watch. "You wear it every day," I said. "You wore it the day we met. You wore it to my parents' house. You'll probably wear it to our wedding." "I will definitely wear it to our wedding." "Tell me about it. For real." He turned his wrist over and looked at the watch. A Timex. Scuffed. The crystal scratched from years of contact with lab benches and kitchen counters and the daily friction of being on a wrist that built things. "My dad bought this watch in 1991, he said. At a Kmart in Cedar Falls. He'd just gotten his first teaching job. 23 years old, biology teacher, starting salary so low he qualified for food stamps for the first 2 years. He bought the watch because he said a teacher should always know what time it is. He wore it every day for 31 years. First day of school, last day of school, parent-teacher nights. The day I graduated high school, the day I told him I was dropping out of my PhD program to start a company he didn't understand. What did he say? He said, I don't know what biotech means, but I know what you look like when you're sure about something, and you look like that right now." Then he gave me the watch. He said, "Take this." So you always remember that the guy who gave it to you was a teacher who made $38,000 a year and was the richest man he knew. Ethan's voice didn't crack. It just got quieter, the way a river gets quieter when it deepens. He died 8 months later. Pancreatic cancer. Diagnosed in September, gone by May. He never saw Helion, never saw the IPO, never saw any of it. Ethan paused. He would have hated the money. He would have loved the work. I understood then not just the watch, but Ethan. Why he drove a Subaru with dog hair on the seats. Why he lived in a 3-bedroom house and wore flannel to conferences and wrote his name on a blank sticker without a title. He wasn't hiding his wealth. He was protecting the thing his father taught him, that you are the work, not the number. "Is that why you never told me?" I asked. "About the company? About how big it is?" "I told you about the company. You said you run a small company. Ethan, your company is worth $5 billion. It's not small." I stared at him. He held the stare for exactly 2 seconds before the corner of his mouth twitched, and I threw a spring roll at him, and he caught it, and we both laughed in a way that filled the kitchen entirely. "I needed to know," he said, after the laughing subsided, "that you'd marry the guy in the flannel shirt, not the guy on the Forbes list. I don't even read Forbes." "I know. That's one of maybe 400 reasons I proposed." 2 days later, Ethan mentioned the way he mentions everything important, casually, while doing something unrelated, in this case refilling the dog's water bowl that a producer friend had been asking to feature our wedding for a TV segment, some series about unconventional weddings. Ethan had always said no, but the producer was also involved with the Helion Foundation's annual fundraiser, and the publicity would help their rural healthcare initiative. It would be a small crew, he said. 2 cameras. Tasteful, they promised. I thought about it for less time than I probably should have. Sure, why not? It's not like my parents will be watching. Ethan glanced up from the water bowl. "You okay with that?" "Ethan, my parents chose a shrimp tower over my wedding. I think I've exhausted my capacity for caring what they think about my media appearances." He nodded. He didn't push. He never pushed. Turns out, planning a wedding without your mother is surprisingly efficient. Nobody cried about napkin colors. Nobody argued about the seating chart. Nobody called to say the flowers were wrong or the invitations were too casual or the venue was a disgrace to the family name. Claire and I made every decision in under 10 minutes, usually over lunch, usually while laughing about something that had nothing to do with weddings. It was, without exaggeration, the most peaceful planning process in the history of matrimony. And somewhere in the middle of it, I realized something I hadn't expected. I wasn't just planning a wedding without my parents. I was discovering what my life felt like, without the weight of their judgment pressing down on every choice I made. It felt light. It felt terrifyingly, wonderfully light. The wedding was 3 weeks away. I had a dress to finish sewing, a barn to decorate, and 0 parents in the front row. And for the first time in 28 years, that math didn't make me sad. It just made me free. I sewed the dress myself. Not because I couldn't afford one. I could, barely, if I dipped into the savings account I'd been building since my first paycheck at 19, but because Grandma June had taught me to sew, and wearing something she'd touched felt closer to having her there than any store-bought fabric ever could. It wasn't couture. The bodice was simple white cotton sateen, fitted with small buttons I'd found at a fabric store in northeast Minneapolis, run by a Somali woman named Amina, who took one look at my sketch and said, "You want romantic, but not precious. I have exactly the material." She was right. The skirt was A-line, T-length, because I was getting married in a barn and a cathedral train would have collected enough hay to feed a horse. I lined the pockets. Yes, pockets. Claire would have rioted otherwise with a strip of fabric from one of Grandma June's old aprons. Blue, with tiny white flowers. Something borrowed. Something blue. Something June. The dress took me 3 weekends. I pricked my fingers so many times the thimble became a permanent fixture. But every stitch was a sentence in a conversation with a woman who wasn't there anymore, and by the time I hemmed the last edge, I'd said everything I needed to say. April 19th arrived the way important days always do, disguised as ordinary. The alarm went off at 6. The sun was already up, which felt like a good sign, though I'm a scientist and I don't believe in signs. I believe in data. And the data that morning said, clear skies, 58 degrees, wind from the southwest at 7 miles per hour. Perfect conditions for an outdoor ceremony in a barn outside Stillwater. Ethan's friend Marcus owned the property, a restored dairy barn on 40 acres of rolling Minnesota farmland. Marcus had made his money in medical devices, sold his company at 40, and now spent his time restoring old buildings and growing heirloom tomatoes. He offered the barn the day Ethan told him we were engaged, and refused to accept $1 for it. "You built me my first prototype in your garage," Marcus said. "The least I can do is give you a place to get married that doesn't have fluorescent lighting." The barn was beautiful. Not Pinterest beautiful, actually beautiful. Rough-hewn beams, wide plank floors, enormous sliding doors that opened onto a field where the grass was just starting to come back after winter. Claire and I had strung lights across the ceiling, hundreds of them, warm white, draped in loose loops that made the whole space glow like the inside of a lantern. The morning of, something happened that I hadn't planned for and couldn't have predicted. Ethan's people started showing up early, not to attend to help. Marcus arrived at 7 with a truck full of wildflowers he'd driven to a farm in Wisconsin to pick up at dawn. Then came Priya, Ethan's chief science officer, a woman who held 3 patents and had once presented to the FDA in heels so high they should have required an engineering degree. She showed up in overalls and spent 2 hours arranging table settings. Then James, Ethan's college roommate, now running a venture fund worth more than some country's GDP, climbed a ladder in jeans and a baseball cap to fix a string of lights that had come loose overnight. These people were, by any external measure, some of the most powerful and wealthy individuals in the biotech world. And here they were on ladders, hauling flower buckets, arguing about whether the chairs should face east or southeast, getting straw in their hair, and not caring. Nobody mentioned money. Nobody mentioned valuations or board seats or quarterly earnings. They were just people who loved Ethan, showing up at a barn, doing the work. I stood in the doorway of the farmhouse watching them, and something hit me that I couldn't name. It wasn't gratitude, exactly. It wasn't joy, though joy was part of it. It was something more disorienting, the feeling of seeing, for the first time, what community looks like when it's not a performance, when showing up isn't a transaction, when people hang lights in a barn, not because they'll be photographed doing it, but because someone they love is getting married and the lights need hanging. My mother had spent my entire life curating a version of community that was really just audience management. Church friends, neighborhood acquaintances, PTA contacts, all arranged carefully, all serving the Aldridge image. What I was looking at through that farmhouse doorway was the opposite. It was messy and loud, and someone had already knocked over a vase and nobody yelled about it. At 2 in the afternoon, I got dressed in a small room upstairs in the farmhouse. Just me and Claire. No bridal party. No mother zipping up the back while whispering advice I didn't ask for. Claire helped with the 3 buttons I couldn't reach. And when she was done, she stepped back and looked at me, and her eyes filled up immediately. "Pockets," she said, pointing at her own dress. Dignity intact. "You're already crying. These are structural tears. Load-bearing. They're holding up the whole operation." I turned to the mirror. The woman looking back was wearing a dress she'd sewn herself, with her grandmother's apron fabric hidden in the lining, standing in a farmhouse in Minnesota, about to marry a man in a barn. No photographer had been summoned to capture the moment. No Facebook post had been drafted. Nobody in Edina knew or cared. And for the first time in my life, I didn't see the wrong daughter. I didn't see the invisible one. I didn't see the girl on the stage, or the woman in the lab bathroom, or the daughter who was never quite enough. I just saw a woman who had chosen her own life and was about to walk into it with her own 2 feet. My hands were shaking, not from fear, from something that lived underneath fear, in a place I didn't have a name for. The feeling of standing at the threshold of a life you chose instead of a life you performed. The vibration of a door opening that you'd built yourself. At 3 o'clock, 63 people sat in mismatched chairs in a barn filled with wildflowers and warm light. The TV crew was there, 2 cameras, discreet, tucked in corners, a producer named Sandra who had promised you won't even know we're here and was, so far, keeping that promise. There was no processional music. I'd chosen silence instead. Not the silence of empty rooms or unanswered phones, a different kind. The silence of a held breath. 63 people, quiet, turning to look at me standing alone in the doorway of the barn. I walked myself down the aisle. No father to give me away. No arm to hold. Just the sound of my shoes on the wooden floor and the rustle of wildflowers in the breeze from the open doors, and 63 people who had shown up for no other reason than that they wanted to be there. Ethan stood at the far end in a navy suit that was the nicest thing I'd ever seen him wear, which wasn't a high bar, but he cleared it beautifully. His dad's tie, a burgundy knit thing from the 90s that had no business looking that perfect, was knotted slightly off-center, and on his wrist, catching the light from 300 string lights, was the $12 Timex from a Kmart in Cedar Falls. He watched me walk toward him, with an expression I'd seen only once before the day at the conference, when I'd pulled up my raw data, and his whole face had rearranged itself, because he'd found something interesting. Only now the interesting thing was me. In a dress with pockets, walking alone. His vows were short because Ethan didn't waste words. I spent 10 years building a company, but the most important thing I've ever built is the courage to stand next to someone who doesn't need me to be anything other than this. He touched the watch. My dad would have liked you. He would have liked that you don't care about the rest of it. My vows were shorter because I'd learned from my grandmother that the most important things fit on the back cover of a recipe book. I spent my whole life collecting evidence that I wasn't enough. You're the first hypothesis I don't need to prove. You're just true, Claire cried. She was right about the pockets. They were structural. After the ceremony, we danced in the barn to a playlist we'd made on a road trip to Duluth, a chaotic mix of Fleetwood Mac and 90s hip-hop and one Patsy Cline song that made everyone over 40 sway and everyone under 40 pretend weren't swaying. Marcus gave a toast that was mostly about a failed prototype and only slightly about love. Priya caught the bouquet and immediately handed it to James, who turned the color of a tomato. The TV crew filmed quietly. Sandra kept her promise. I forgot they were there entirely, which was either a testament to their professionalism or to the fact that I was, for the first time in my life, not performing for a camera real or imagined. The segment aired 4 days later. Prime time. I had forgotten about it entirely. My mother had not. The segment aired on a Tuesday evening, 4 days after the wedding. Ethan and I were on the couch watching a documentary about octopuses, his choice, because Ethan believed cephalopods were the most underrated engineers on the planet, and I'd learned to pick my battles. My phone was on the kitchen counter, face down, where it had lived peacefully since the wedding. Claire texted first. All capitals. No punctuation. Turn on channel 7 right. Now do it now, Vanessa. I am not kidding. I showed Ethan the text. He squinted at it. Oh, he said, that thing aired tonight? We didn't turn it on. Claire sent a follow-up. It's beautiful they showed the vows, the barn looks incredible, also they put his net worth on screen. Ethan closed his eyes slowly, the way a man does when he remembers something he should have anticipated. Sandra, he said. I told her no chirons. What did the chiron say? Probably my name and the company, and a number I don't like talking about. The $5 billion number? 5.2. Technically, but who's counting? Sandra is counting. Sandra put it on national television. He rubbed his face with both hands. I'm going to send her a very diplomatic email. You're going to send her a fruit basket because you don't know how to be mean to anyone. That is also possible. We went back to the octopuses. My phone buzzed on the counter a few more times. I didn't check it. The octopus was building a shelter out of coconut shells, and honestly, that felt more relevant to my life than whatever was happening on Channel 7. I didn't find out what happened in Ashley's living room until 2 weeks later, when Ashley called me for the first time since the wedding, the first time she'd called me voluntarily in maybe 3 years. Her voice was different, quieter, like someone had turned down a dial I didn't know she had. She told me they were at her condo. Mom, Dad, leftover birthday cake from the yacht party on the coffee table. The TV was on in the background, the way it always was in any room Linda occupied. Not for watching, but for the ambient sense that the world was still running outside her control. The lifestyle segment came on, some series about unconventional weddings. Ashley said Mom wasn't paying attention until she heard my name. Then the camera showed the barn, the wildflowers, the string lights. Then me, in my dress, walking alone down the aisle. Then Ethan, in his dad's tie, and across the bottom of the screen, Ethan Cross, founder and CEO, Helion Biosystems. Estimated net worth, $5.2 billion. Ashley said Mom's fork hit the plate so hard it chipped the porcelain. Dad put down his coffee and didn't pick it back up. Ashley said the room went completely still. And then Mom said, and this is a direct quote, because Ashley repeated it 3 times to make sure I heard it right. That can't be right. That can't be right. 4 words. Not I'm happy for her. Not she looked beautiful. Not we should have been there. Just, that can't be right. Because in my mother's world, the wrong daughter doesn't marry a billionaire. The wrong daughter marries someone who drives a Subaru and wears a watch from Kmart. And that's the story. That's the only version she'd authorized. The voicemail started 17 minutes after the segment ended. I know because my phone logged them, and I read the transcripts later, one by one, with the clinical interest of a researcher reviewing results from an experiment she hadn't designed. The first one, at 8:32 p.m. Vanessa, where are you? Call me back. We saw there was a call me. The second, at 8:54. Sweetheart, we just saw the most wonderful segment on TV. Your wedding looked beautiful. I wish you'd told us it was being filmed. We would have loved to be there. The third, at 9:41. I always told your father that Ethan was special. Didn't I, Richard? I said that from the first dinner. I said he had something about him. I could hear my father in the background of that one. Linda, just. Richard, I am talking to my daughter. The fourth arrived the next morning, at 7:15, which meant my mother had spent the night recalibrating her entire narrative and had woken up with a fresh draft. I don't understand why you didn't tell us about the television thing. We would have loved to have been there. You know how much family means to us. This is hurtful, Vanessa. I feel very excluded. Excluded. My mother, who chose a yacht and a shrimp tower over my wedding, felt excluded from the television segment she didn't know existed about the event she refused to attend. The audacity wasn't even impressive anymore. It was just sad. Ashley told me later that the church calls started the next day. Linda's friends, the ones she'd told I was going through a phase, the ones she'd assured that the barn wedding was a minor embarrassment that wouldn't reflect on the family, every single one of them had seen the segment or heard about it from someone who had. Linda, why weren't you at your own daughter's wedding? Linda, did you know about the company? Linda, I saw the most beautiful ceremony. Was that really a barn? It looked like something out of a magazine. My mother's carefully constructed story that Vanessa was the difficult one, the stubborn one, the daughter who insisted on doing things the hard way collapsed in a single news cycle. Not because I'd exposed her, not because I'd fought back, but because the truth aired on Channel 7 at 8 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the truth didn't need my help. Ashley was quiet at the end of the call. Then she said something I didn't expect. The barn looked really nice, Vanessa. I mean it. It looked like you. I didn't know what to say to that. So I said, thanks, Ash. And then, after a pause so long, I thought she'd hung up. Derek and I had 200 people at our wedding. A planner, a florist, a string quartet. And I don't remember what my vows were. She hung up before I could respond. but I heard the sound of a woman standing at the edge of a question she wasn't ready to answer. I knew that sound. I'd been making it my whole life. My phone had 14 missed calls by the next morning. I read every notification. Then I made a decision. I sat at the kitchen table the next morning with my phone face up in front of me. 14 missed calls from Linda, 3 from Richard, 1 from Ashley, but that one I'd already returned. The voicemail transcripts lined up on the screen like lab results, each one telling the same story from a slightly more desperate angle. Ethan made coffee. He set a mug next to my phone without saying anything, then leaned against the counter with his own mug and waited. He was good at waiting. Most people fill silence because they're afraid of what lives in it. Ethan left silence alone because he trusted what would come out the other side. I picked up the phone. Read through the transcripts one more time. The evolution was almost clinical. Confusion, then revision, then nostalgia she hadn't earned, then guilt repackaged as hurt. My mother, rewriting the history of a wedding she chose to miss, in real time, with the confidence of a woman who had never once been wrong, because she had never once allowed the possibility. The latest text, from 7 this morning. Vanessa, please call me. We need to talk about the wedding. We should do a proper reception. I have ideas. She had ideas. Of course she did. She always had ideas for Ashley's life, for Richard's silence, for the version of me that didn't exist, but would have been so much more convenient if it did. Linda Aldridge had spent 57 years arranging the world into a shape that confirmed her, and now one Chiron on a Tuesday night had rearranged it back, and she was scrambling to regain control of a story that was never hers to tell. I typed one character, the laughing emoji, the one with tears. I looked at it on the screen for a moment, this tiny yellow face that said everything I'd spent 28 years trying to say with degrees and trophies and perfect datasets. Then I pressed send. I put the phone face down on the table. That was it. No long letter. No itemized list of grievances. No final confrontation where I stood in her living room and delivered the speech I'd rehearsed 1,000 times in the shower. I'd imagined that speech for years, the one where I finally told her about the science fair, about the scholarship she shrugged off, about every Facebook post that featured Ashley and erased me. In my imagination, the speech always ended with her crying, with her understanding, with her saying, "I'm sorry, Vanessa. I see you now." But I didn't need the speech anymore, because the speech was still a performance, a closing argument for a jury I'd already dismissed. I told Ethan, "I'm not angry at them. I'm just done translating myself into a language they refused to learn." He nodded. "So what do you want to do today?" I looked at the recipe book on the counter. Battered, stained, held together with stubbornness and a rubber band Grandma June had probably put there in 2014. I opened it to a page near the back blueberry cobbler, marked in June's handwriting with a small star and the note, "Vanessa's celebration cake. For whenever she wins something, which is always, I want to make cobbler," I said. So I did. I made Grandma June's blueberry cobbler on a Wednesday morning in Minneapolis, while my phone sat face down on the table and my husband read the newspaper at the counter, and the dog, a golden retriever named Kepler, because Ethan named everything after scientists slept on the kitchen floor with his legs in the air. The apartment smelled like butter and blueberries and brown sugar, and underneath all of that, something older and quieter, the smell of a kitchen where someone once paid attention. I followed the recipe exactly, except for the butter, where June's margin note said more with an underline so deep it dented the next page, so I added more. While the cobbler baked, I went to the hall closet and pulled out the box I'd unpacked that night on the floor. The science fair trophy was still inside, nested in a winter coat. I picked it up. Cheap gold plastic, slightly off-center engraving, heavier than it should be for what it cost. I carried it to the kitchen and set it on the shelf above the stove, between a potted herb I kept meaning to water and a framed photo of Grandma June at the diner, smiling over pancakes. The trophy fit there. Not because it proved anything, not because anyone would see it and understand what it meant, but because it was mine. And this shelf was mine, and this kitchen was mine. And for the first time, that was the only audience that mattered. The oven timer went off. I pulled out the cobbler, golden and bubbling at the edges. Not perfect, not magazine-worthy, but exactly right. Ethan put down his newspaper. Kepler woke up. I served 2 bowls, and we sat on the couch and ate blueberry cobbler at 10 in the morning on a Wednesday because there was nobody left to tell us that was wrong. My phone buzzed once more. I didn't look. Ethan, with his mouth full. Your mom? Me, with my mouth fuller. Probably. You okay? I leaned back into the couch. The dog put his head on my foot. The cobbler was warm, and the apartment was quiet, and the trophy was on the shelf where it belonged. I'm eating my grandmother's blueberry cobbler with my husband on a Wednesday morning. I'm better than okay. The phone buzzed again. I let it. Some doors don't close with a slam. They close with a cobbler recipe, and a plastic trophy, and a laughing emoji sent to a woman who will never understand why it was the only answer her daughter had left to give. What do you think love is supposed to look like when it comes from the people who gave you life but never gave you permission to live it?